Okay, here's the translation, aiming for a natural, native speaker tone suitable for a History Channel presentation. Let's journey back in time to unravel a mystery. Welcome, esteemed viewers, to our channel, History and Mythology. Today we'll embark on a thrilling dive into the depths of antiquity to grasp the secrets of one of the most famous and enigmatic rulers of all time, Cleopatra. Why does her fate still captivate minds, blending incredible allure and profound tragedy? Subscribe to the channel, give us a like, and let's explore her unique life journey together. So, our journey begins in the glittering city of Alexandria, Cleopatra VII. Philopator, the last ruler of the mighty Ptolemaic dynasty, came into the world in 69 BC. It's crucial to understand that this dynasty wasn't originally Egyptian. It traced its origins back to Ptolemy Soter, one of Alexander the Great's distinguished generals, who became the ruler of Egypt after the great conqueror's death. Cleopatra grew up and was educated right at the epicenter of palace intrigue and fierce political struggles, where literally every misstep could be fatal, leading not just to the loss of power, but of life itself. What shaped this extraordinary figure? A key aspect of her multifaceted education was the deep study of various languages and philosophy. This transformed her from a mere heir to the throne into a highly educated woman, capable of strategic thinking and skillfully governing the country, relying not only on her lineage but also on her knowledge. From a young age, Cleopatra clearly understood that to preserve Egypt's independence and prosperity in an ever-changing world, it was necessary to build complex and sometimes perilous diplomatic relationships with neighboring powers, and primarily with the rising power of Rome. Modern researchers and historians, analyzing her actions, conclude that Cleopatra demonstrated a truly remarkable combination of brilliant intellect and exceptional strategic thinking. Her political views and preferences were heavily influenced by the unique environment in which she spent her childhood and youth. Her palace upbringing was a harsh but effective school. It taught her not only the subtleties of manipulating people and circumstances, but also a deep understanding of the very essence of politics. This foundation of knowledge and skills played a crucial role in her ability to skillfully conduct negotiations and forge alliances vital to Egypt. Despite the traditional limitations faced by women in ancient Egypt, Cleopatra knew how to leverage her strengths most effectively. Her beauty and innate charisma undoubtedly opened many doors for her, but the true key to her success in making the most critical state decisions was precisely her sharp intellect and comprehensive education. She actively sought to overcome the biases and stereotypes prevalent in her era regarding female rulers, and took on the responsibilities not just of a nominal queen, but of a real, active administrator whose decisions directly impacted the fates of thousands. Cleopatra's path to absolute power lay through a period of exceptional instability for Egypt. After the death of her father, Ptolemy XIV, and the subsequent death of her brother and co-ruler Ptolemy XIII, she found herself facing a colossal challenge, holding on to Egypt amidst the rapidly growing influence of mighty Rome. Complex family relationships, palace intrigue, and external threats lurked at every turn. But it was precisely these trials that forged her character and strengthened her resolve to act. It was during this critical period that Cleopatra took her first deliberate and bold step onto the stage of grand, global politics. She clearly realized that the only chance for Egypt's salvation and preservation might lie in an alliance with powerful Rome. Her brilliant education, received in the famed Alexandria, one of the greatest centers of knowledge and culture in the ancient world, allowed her to form a clear and profound understanding of the political realities and nuances of both the Roman Republic and the Egyptian kingdom. This enabled her to subtly analyze the characters and ambitions of Roman leaders like Gaius Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and, most importantly, to understand how to leverage these ambitions for the benefit of her country and herself. Her personal ambitions and indomitable drive for power, contrary to later Roman myths, might have been a genuine boon for her people and country had she managed to maintain independence. Cleopatra's attempts to strengthen Egypt's sovereignty spawned numerous rumors and gossip, actively spread by enemies in Rome and beyond. In this negative propaganda, she was often depicted as a cunning and immoral manipulator, using only her beauty and charms to achieve political goals. In reality, as more objective research shows, Cleopatra was an exceptionally astute strategist and far-sighted politician, masterfully utilizing all available resources, from diplomacy and economic leverage to personal charm, to strengthen her position and preserve Egypt as an independent state. It's no surprise that her reign, despite all difficulties, became the foundation upon which she could move to the next stage, establishing strong, albeit dangerous, foreign ties. Thus, step by step, the figure of Cleopatra emerged not just as a formal ruler, but as a formidable politician and woman, delving ever deeper and more consciously into the complex political and social processes of her time. Her wisdom, determination, and often unconventional decisions in critical situations not only helped consolidate her reign initially, but also laid the groundwork for an Egyptian diplomatic policy that allowed it to survive a while longer under her rule, despite external pressure. These qualities enabled her not only to survive in the brutal world of ancient politics, but also to secure a prominent place in history as the last and most brilliant representative of the Ptolemaic dynasty. After the death of her father, Ptolemy XIII, Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy IV formally shared the Egyptian throne. However, real power in the country fell into the sinister hands of incompetent and ambitious court eunuchs and military figures who placed their narrow interests far above those of the state. Possessing sharp political acumen and an instinctive ability to recognize threats and manipulate people, Cleopatra quickly realized that webs of conspiracy were being woven behind her back and the shadows of danger were gathering. Her brother, though young and less experienced, was heavily influenced by the regents and reveled in his position, only exacerbating the growing hostility between brother and sister. Recognizing the criticality of the brewing situation and understanding her precarious position, she began developing a complex strategy to consolidate power entirely in her own hands, to maintain her influence and ultimately save Egypt from external dependence or internal collapse. It was vital for her to forge new, powerful political alliances. The most obvious and, as it seemed to her, promising path was to attract the attention and support of Rome, the up-and-coming and clearly dominant Mediterranean empire, which could serve as her shield against internal and external enemies. Cleopatra knew perfectly well that Rome at that time was in a state of acute political turmoil and exhausting civil war for power. This was not only a threat, but also a unique opportunity. Her approach was to present herself to Roman leaders as a wise, capable, and trustworthy ruler, ready for a mutually beneficial alliance based not just on strength, but on diplomacy. She began drafting a detailed plan aimed at establishing strong personal connections with key figures on the Roman political scene. Cleopatra's ability to build complex, multi-layered personal and professional relationships became her most potent weapon in her diplomatic arsenal. She carefully studied existing sympathies and antipathies among the Roman elites to pinpoint potential future allies and identify those to be wary of. She actively used all her personal charm, intellect, and brilliant intellectual preparation with the sole purpose of making her figure as noticeable and significant as possible on the turbulent political stage of the ancient world. Cleopatra, thanks to her unique education, decided to leverage her exceptional language skills. Fluency in Greek, the language of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and Egyptian, the language of her people, made her unique among many rulers, allowing her to communicate directly with subjects and foreigners without interpreters. Her decision to actively form mutually beneficial connections and use diplomatic provocations, or rather artfully crafted situations, to draw Rome's attention to Egypt became the first decisive step towards advancing her own urgent needs and interests. Meanwhile, internal difficulties and the deepening conflict with her brother Ptolemy XIII led to open hostility erupting between Cleopatra and the courtiers controlling her brother. These clashes only intensified the split within the ruling dynasty and catastrophically narrowed her room for maneuver. Ptolemy XIII, unprepared for rule and unable to build a strong base of support, was under the complete control of his regents, making him a puppet and an indirect source of threat to Cleopatra, but simultaneously a source of her unique power in the eyes of those seeking a strong leader. Cleopatra, realizing her safety and plans were under threat, began actively rallying support from those loyal to her personally, not to the court cliques. She clearly understood that only after eliminating or neutralizing alternative claimants to the throne, primarily her brother and his regents, could she effectively implement her ambitious plan to enlist Rome. In these troubled and dangerous times, Cleopatra demonstrated a truly astonishing ability to navigate between internal enemies and the looming external threat, actively seeking and creating opportunities to strengthen her weakened position. Rome's attention, torn by its own problems, began to turn increasingly towards wealthy Egypt, and Cleopatra knew exactly how, under the circumstances, to use this interest to her advantage. With each calculated step, she moved closer to achieving her main strategic goal, gaining the trust and influence of the most powerful men of her time. Thus, Cleopatra clearly recognized her survival and the security of her rule depended on her ability to find a way to merge external and internal interests. Otherwise, her dynasty and Egypt itself could face the threat of absorption. Every move she made was meticulously planned. She anticipated her opponent's actions, sought the slightest loopholes for a potential coup or strengthening of her position, and clearly understood that only through exceptional cunning, flexibility, and extreme persistence could she defend her standing in Egypt. Her struggle and her decisions were a crucial element in a much broader political game that ultimately changed the course of history for the entire ancient world, defining the fate not only of Egypt but also of the Roman Republic. The situation in Egypt grew more tense by the day. The country was plunging into a maelstrom of political intrigue, internal conflict, and power struggles. Cleopatra, sidelined from real governance by her brother's regents, knew she needed to take decisive and immediate action. With her father's death and the nominal ascension of her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, the influence and power she, as the elder heir, could and should have wielded in Egypt's governance were seriously jeopardized. The military potential and growing political might of Rome, already clearly showing its ambitions in the Eastern Mediterranean, captured Cleopatra's intense focus. She realized with absolute clarity that the support of such a powerful external ally was perhaps the only path to restoring her status and regaining full authority. At this very moment in history, Gaius Julius Caesar appeared on the scene, at the time actively engaged with his own problems and civil wars within the Roman Republic. Caesar saw in a potential alliance with Cleopatra and Egypt not only an opportunity to bolster his own precarious position in Rome, but also a way to guarantee security and control over the wealthiest region on the eastern borders of his future empire. This alliance was extremely advantageous to him, and he sought to fully exploit the unstable political situation in Egypt to achieve his strategic goals. Cleopatra, possessing outstanding diplomatic skills and an indomitable desire to rise above her internal enemies, decided that the only way to capture Caesar's attention and sympathy was to make a truly unforgettable impression on him. She planned an astonishing and extravagant meeting, designed not merely as an introduction, but as a spectacular start to their mutually beneficial political and, as it turned out, personal alliance. When Cleopatra was supposed to appear before Caesar, who was in Alexandria, she chose a truly unconventional and daring method. She had herself wrapped in a carpet, or, according to other versions, bedding, and was literally delivered to his feet as an unusual gift or package. This extraordinary gesture struck the seasoned Caesar to the core, compelling him to see Cleopatra not just as another Eastern monarch or potential political partner, but as a woman of exceptional courage intellect, and charisma, capable of sparking his genuine interest and sympathy. The meeting, which became legendary and entered all historical annals, instantly forged a bond between the two ambitious and powerful rulers and set the tone for their future relationship, which grew far beyond mere political calculation. Cleopatra used all her charm, sharp mind, and education to captivate Caesar, who in turn was genuinely impressed by her determination, her deep knowledge of Rome, and her outstanding qualities as a ruler. Caesar, seeing in her a strong and reliable partner, agreed to become her protector, making significant military and political contributions to restoring Cleopatra's full authority and eliminating her rivals, including her brother. He understood perfectly well that her firm control over Egypt, while maintaining its status as a Roman ally, would on the contrary create clear strategic advantages for the Roman Republic, ensuring grain supplies and financial support. In turn, Cleopatra masterfully used the circumstances to rapidly consolidate her position on the throne. She quickly made a deep and lasting impression on Caesar with her culture, education, knowledge of many languages, and understanding of world politics. She was a woman who did not just passively rely on her circumstances, but skillfully and actively used them to achieve her grand objectives. From that moment, the alliance between Cleopatra and Caesar became an inseparable part of the complex political game unfolding in both Rome and Egypt. This became a truly significant moment that literally redrew many previous boundaries and notions about relationships between the great powers of the time. Cleopatra's indomitable drive to restore her lost influence and power over her country became tightly bound with Caesar's immense thirst to increase his personal power and dominance in Rome. Mutual respect and flexibility in this relationship, based on both partners' willingness to compromise for a common goal, became the solid foundation of their political alliance, which eventually, influenced by personal feelings, blossomed into something much greater, a romantic relationship. Cleopatra, desiring not just the preservation of her throne, but also lasting peace and security for her people, became a true strategist and master of the art of high politics. All this unfolded against the tense backdrop of rapidly developing events in Rome itself, where political instability only worsened after Caesar's victory in the Civil War, but before the full establishment of his dictatorship. This environment paradoxically opened new horizons for political maneuvering in both Egypt and Rome, making the Cleopatra-Caesar alliance a key piece in the power mosaic. Following their successful and fateful meeting in Alexandria, Cleopatra and Gaius Julius Caesar began a romantic relationship which, beyond personal affection, quickly became an important political tool as well. Their union became not only the embodiment of personal passion between two strong individuals, but also a vivid reflection of the complex and multi-layered political maneuvering of the time. Cleopatra, possessing a sharp mind and far-sighted strategic thinking, understood perfectly that this personal alliance could be a powerful lever to enhance her power and influence, as a strong bond with the mighty Roman leader could elevate Egypt's status to a completely new level in world politics. Many historians believe Cleopatra bore Caesar a son named Ptolemy Caesarion, literally meaning Little Caesar. This boy became for her not just a child, but a symbol of immense hope, a chance to prolong the Ptolemaic dynasty's existence and even create a unique union of two great worlds, Egyptian and Roman. She saw him as her legitimate heir and potential savior, who, she dreamed, would become a symbol of strength and unity, capable of resisting both internal palace intrigues and the external threat from Rome after Caesar's departure. However, her personal life, so closely intertwined with politics, was doomed to dramatic twists and complexities. Difficulties were not long in coming. After Caesar's assassination in March 44 BC, Cleopatra suddenly found herself a ruler deprived of her most powerful and reliable ally. Now she faced new, even more serious challenges. Caesar's great-nephew Octavian, then young but extremely ambitious and calculating, aspired to supreme power in Rome and made no secret of his intentions, actively gathering Caesar's supporters and veterans around him. Tension on the Roman political stage, and consequently in relations between Rome and Egypt, only intensified. Cleopatra vitally needed to take this into account. She had not just to preserve her throne, but also to continue playing extremely complex political games amidst a shifting balance of power. She knew that to retain power and protect Egypt, she would need to find a new influential ally in Rome, perhaps even more reliable or at least no less powerful than her deceased lover and patron. This became a true test of her political intuition, but Cleopatra was confident in her abilities and understood she needed to act quickly and thoughtfully to deny her enemies the chance to conquer and subjugate Egypt. Soon after Caesar's tragic death, Cleopatra turned her perceptive gaze towards Mark Antony, one of the most influential and charismatic Roman commanders and politicians of the time, a member of the forming Second Triumvirate. Their meeting, orchestrated by Cleopatra and Tarsus in 41 BC, marked the beginning of a new, equally passionate and politically significant romantic and military alliance. Her outstanding skills in diplomacy, strategic planning, and personal charm were once again brought to the forefront of high politics. Although Antony quickly showed genuine interest in Cleopatra, his own immense political ambitions in Rome and complex ties with other Roman leaders also made their relationship potentially dangerous and requiring constant balancing. Cleopatra understood perfectly that even love, passion, and personal affection could be effectively used as powerful political tools. She was ready to employ all her charms, intellect, and diplomatic talent to achieve her goals: strengthen the alliance, gain Antony's support, and protect Egypt. Cleopatra invested all her efforts and political capital into her relationship with Antony, striving not only to bolster her personal position, but also to make Egypt an indispensable partner for Antony in his struggle for power in Rome. However, Antony's circle and political factions in Rome remained hostile to the Eastern Queen. She tried to convince Antony of Egypt's strategic importance as a key ally, a source of wealth and resources, while continuing to play her own political games, creating situations that could give her an advantage in this complex and dangerous world of intrigue. But as with Caesar, Cleopatra's personal life was once again inextricably linked with enormous political risks. Behind this union lay not only romantic affection, but also a huge amount of ambition, mutual expectations, and carefully calculated strategies. Cleopatra was prepared to wage this exhausting battle for her right to power and Egypt's independence to the very end, even if it meant constantly balancing on the fine line between love and political interests. Passion flared again in her life, but more significantly, a threat reappeared on the horizon, one that would ultimately unite the fates of Egypt and Rome in a tragic chapter of history. Meanwhile, in Rome itself, the situation grew increasingly tense. After Gaius Julius Caesar's assassination, the Roman aristocracy and influential political circles definitively split into opposing camps. One supported Octavian, Caesar's young and calculating great-nephew and heir, who aimed for sole power. The other rallied around Mark Antony, who enjoyed the support of many of Caesar's veterans and controlled the wealthy eastern provinces. The formation of the Second Triumvirate between Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus was a temporary truce, but the underlying struggle continued. For Cleopatra, this situation created both potential opportunities and serious threats. She realized that to restore and, crucially, maintain the tyranny, translators note, tyranny in the original seems like a strong word, maybe absolute rule, or simply power is better? Let's stick closer to power rule for now. Her power in Egypt, she needed a strong Roman hand as a patron. She decided to turn specifically to Antony, who, being one of the most influential members of the triumvirate and the de facto ruler of the eastern part of the Roman Republic, possessed the necessary resources and authority to help her. Antony, an experienced commander and seasoned politician, had already heard much of Cleopatra's fame. Her legendary beauty, her diplomatic skill, and, of course, her success in attracting Caesar. He was filled with curiosity and perhaps a desire to surpass his late patron. He not only hoped for Egypt's financial and human resources, desperately needed for his military campaigns in the East, against Parthia, for example, but also undoubtedly felt a strong personal attraction to Cleopatra. Cleopatra, having accumulated knowledge of diplomatic methods and psychology throughout her life amidst palace intrigues, was determined to impress him and show that he needed not just Egypt's material aid, but also a wise, loyal ally in her, who could significantly strengthen his standing among Romans. Their meeting in Tarsus was not accidental or spontaneous. It was carefully orchestrated by Cleopatra and accompanied by extraordinary pomp and a display of Egyptian royal splendor. Cleopatra arrived on a richly decorated barge, dressed as the goddess Isis, using all her charm and theatricality. Their romantic relationship developed rapidly, as did the numerous political intrigues surrounding them. Cleopatra became more than just a lover or formal ally to Antony. She evolved into a woman capable of genuinely influencing his decisions, the course of his military campaigns, and his political plans. Antony, captivated by her charisma, intellect, and undoubtedly Egypt's riches, began expressing full support for all her endeavors and ambitions in the East, which often conflicted with the interests of Rome, controlled by Octavian. In turn, Cleopatra actively supported his aspirations for power in Rome. They started making large-scale plans for joint military actions, aimed not only at strengthening Antony's position, but also at restoring Egypt's former glory, which, as they both seemed to believe, was impossible without this powerful Roman-Egyptian alliance. However, like any political intrigue, their bond was shrouded in uncertainty and constant threat. Octavian was not idle. He too was making plans, seeing Antony as his main rival on the path to sole power in Rome. He skillfully used Antony's relationship with Cleopatra to discredit him in the eyes of the Roman people and Senate, portraying him as a man who had lost his head over an Eastern queen and betrayed Roman values. This realization brought a new level of anxiety to Cleopatra and Antony, but simultaneously provided a powerful impetus for joint action. Antony became even more dependent on Cleopatra, as her financial and military support could be the decisive factor in his upcoming battle for supremacy over the entire Roman world. Yet she herself took an enormous risk by involving herself in Antony's political career, which was fraught with contradictions and conflicts with his Roman triumvirate colleagues. Their relationship, this unique blend of love, ambition, and political calculation, became a potent factor influencing the fates of both Egypt and Rome. Cleopatra, driven by her indomitable desire to restore the might of her country and dynasty, invested all her strength and resources in supporting Antony, dreaming not only of his personal triumph, but also of the revival of her Egypt, poised on the brink of an abyss. Every step they took together, every strategic maneuver, was carefully calculated, as a single mistake could lead to catastrophic consequences for both them and their states. Despite the strong romantic undertones of their relationship, the main focus of their mutually beneficial alliances, especially as the conflict with Octavian intensified, increasingly shifted towards political maneuvering and military strategy. Thus, between the two powers, Egypt and the eastern part of the Roman Republic, a new scenario for the struggle for dominance over the entire Mediterranean was unfolding. Cleopatra and Antony, aware of the importance and fragility of their alliance, began actively asserting their strength in these global political games, understanding that only through coordinated joint actions could they hope for the survival of their dynasties and the preservation of their influence. Preparing for a new era of confrontation, their drive for power, mutual affection, and quest for understanding not only strengthened their positions on the political stage, but also shaped entirely new, previously unseen rules of the game in the high politics of antiquity. However, their alliance, seemingly so strong, was not without complexities and faced constant attacks. The Romans, primarily Octavian, continuously took steps to weaken Cleopatra and Antony's influence, using propaganda and political intrigue. Tension grew not only from external threats but also from the internal struggle in Rome, where Octavian methodically undermined Antony's position. Antony's own strategic errors and the unstable situation in his eastern territories placed Egypt under increasing threat. Every move Cleopatra made to preserve her power and her ally entangled her further in a web of betrayal, manipulation, and increasingly risky decisions, only adding to the complications. Octavian, an unsurpassed master of manipulation and political propaganda, seized every opportunity to portray Antony as a traitor to the Roman Republic, captivated by an Eastern queen. He depicted their relationship as a symbol of immorality and decline, contrasting it with his own Roman virtues. This created an extremely negative image in Rome, seriously undermining Antony's position and consequently Cleopatra's. She was well aware that securing her position required confronting not only external enemies but also internal threats within the Allied camp and in Egypt itself. The situation became a matter of life and death. The alliance with Antony, which had seemed a solid foundation, rapidly began to crumble under the pressure of Roman intrigue and Octavian's military preparations. Alongside the psychological and political warfare, Octavian focused on undermining Egypt's financial and economic base, trying to deprive Cleopatra of the resources needed to maintain her army and influence. He methodically built up his armies and fleet, preparing for the next decisive step that could shatter everything. Cleopatra understood that her every move had to be thought through to the smallest detail. An atmosphere of fear, distrust, and suspicion reigned in her inner circle. She carefully filtered the advice from her confidants but found with bitterness that even among those she considered most loyal, traitors might lurk, ready to sell her out for their own gain. Knowing that each of her decisions could change the course of history, Cleopatra strategically managed her limited resources and options, trying to find a way out. But Antony, too, was under immense pressure. Striving to protect his own interests in Rome and reacting to Octavian's actions, he sometimes fell into traps set by his political enemies. Cleopatra tried to support him, strengthening diplomatic ties and providing resources, but repeatedly faced an unavoidable choice. What was more important, Antony's ambitions or Egypt's safety? Each of their meetings, especially as the final confrontation loomed, became increasingly tense. Their communications shifted from personal and emotional to purely strategic, each time a reminder of the incredibly high stakes. Common enemies undoubtedly forced them to act cohesively against the external threat, but internal conflicts, misunderstandings, and old grievances created cracks in their alliance. Cleopatra often felt squeezed between Antony's vast political ambitions and the vital necessity of ensuring her people's independence and survival. The drive to succeed in this last desperate political struggle intensified. The future grew increasingly uncertain, and victory no longer seemed assured. The love that once united them, the romantic bond between them, faded into the gloom of impending conflicts, where not only their lives but the fate of great Egypt hung in the balance. Day by day, it felt as though their union, conceived as a strong foundation for a new world, was beginning to fracture under external pressure and internal contradictions. War and defeat. The inevitable conflict between Antony and Octavian reached its bloody climax at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BC. In this fateful battle off the western coast of Greece, the fleet of Cleopatra and Antony clashed with the superior forces of the Roman legions and navy under the command of Agrippa, Octavian's talented general. Antony and Cleopatra's ships suffered a crushing defeat, which became not just a military failure, but a turning point in the history of the entire ancient world and its politics. The scene on the battlefield was horrifying. The vast expanse of sea, bathed in bright sunlight reflecting off the armored hulls of Roman ships, became an arena of tragedy. The Roman legions and fleet, well-drilled and disciplined, with flawlessly coordinated actions, outperformed Antony and Cleopatra's forces in both training and tactics. Antony's fleet, largely composed of hastily hired ships or those provided by allies, lacked cohesion. Antony's strategic plan, based on his aim to unite forces with Cleopatra and perhaps break through or maneuver, fell victim to adverse circumstances, superior Roman tactics, and possibly his own errors. Under pressure from time and resources, he hadn't managed to prepare enough experienced sailors and defenders for his ships. Each ally wrote their own fate on the battlefield, and unlike the Romans, who acted with cool calculation under unified command, Cleopatra and Antony's fleet suffered the consequences of fighting more by instinct for survival than according to a clear plan. Ships burned, torn apart by artillery and rams. Sailors lost hope, watching their formation crumble. Amidst this chaos, for reasons still debated by historians, perhaps an attempted breakout or a pre-planned withdrawal, Cleopatra's squadron turned and left the battlefield, heading for Egypt. Antony followed her. This signaled the complete rout of his remaining forces. After this terrible defeat at Actium, the shadow of inevitable collapse fell upon Cleopatra and Antony. Every day that passed after the battle brought new trials, mass desertions among remaining soldiers and allies, growing discontent among their supporters, and complete moral decay. Cleopatra understood perfectly that her influence was rapidly evaporating, and the legions once loyal to Antony now began to condemn his actions and Cleopatra herself. Her journeys through defeat-ravaged Egypt reminded her of the old glorious days of the Ptolemaic kingdom, and in her heart grew not only bitterness from insult and betrayal, but also a chilling fear for the future of her children and her people. What world would they leave behind if the fall seemed inevitable and the disciplined ranks of Octavian's Roman soldiers, advancing on Egypt, were already clearly visible on the horizon? They faced the hardest choice: fight a final, hopeless battle or flee, which was also nearly impossible. Antony, broken by the calamities of war and paralyzed by fear of total defeat, recognized the gravity of the situation, but his ambitions, his pride, and his Roman identity wouldn't allow him to simply retreat or surrender. Cleopatra, on the other hand, knew that as queen, she bore direct and final responsibility for the future of her people and her dynasty. Each understood that for their continued existence, for their dynasty, the only solution might be a risky and desperate act, capable of either saving or utterly destroying both them and everything they had built. Choosing the path to take in this desperate situation required immense courage and extreme strategic thinking, even when the odds were nil. With each passing day, their hopes dwindled, turning to dust, and the images of the clashes they couldn't avoid at Actium became ever clearer. Antony peered into the clouds of suspicion, trying to hold on to his few remaining supporters, while Cleopatra insisted on unity in their final public appearances, futilely trying to evoke memories of more prosperous times in the people. Each knew that in that atmosphere, surrounded by betrayal and defeat, there was no longer any possibility for real support or elevation. But the real and merciless consequences of their decisions dispassionately reflected the tragic mood of the people, sensing the end. Time was relentlessly running out, and enduring this madness seemed an increasingly complex and insurmountable task. Fearing that every word they spoke might be their last, they experienced an agonizing paralysis of action, always mindful that their fate now depended entirely on the nightmarish choice between dishonor and death. The gaze of eternity and romance that once united them slowly slipped away, leaving only the desperate possibility of struggle in the face of relentless destiny. Collapse and consequences. After the crushing Battle of Actium, Cleopatra and Antony's position became hopelessly precarious. Octavian, having secured a decisive victory, began the methodical and inevitable conquest of Egypt. Cleopatra, filled with the deepest anxiety for the fate of her people, and crucially her children, understood that the days of her independent rule were numbered. Left without a reliable ally and having suffered military defeat, she faced complete humiliation and the loss of everything dear to her. Each passing day left only uncertainty and fear of what awaited her and her family under the rule of the Roman victor. With every minute, she realized that her long-held dreams of restoring Egypt's former glory were rapidly slipping away, becoming unattainable. The course of events rapidly unfolding between the rival Roman leaders had turned into a trap for Cleopatra, one almost impossible to escape. The Roman army was approaching and resistance was futile. She actively, but ultimately futilely, sought ways to preserve her throne, negotiate with Octavian, or at least ensure her family's safety. However, every step she took under mounting pressure led her further away from the desired victory or even an honorable surrender. Within the palace, anxiety and paranoia grew. Her entire status and last hopes depended on power that was literally slipping through her fingers. She knew that with each day her influence on the world stage diminished, and those who had once surrounded her with flattery and promises began to distance themselves, betraying her on the field of this lost political battle. Antony had always been prey to his enormous ambitions, but he was also her support, her partner, her love. With his tragic death, he committed suicide after false news of Cleopatra's death, or after the final defeat. Cleopatra lost not only a partner in power, but also the person with whom she shared her most secret dreams and plans for the future. The moment she learned of his demise, the world around her literally became empty and joyless. Dark thoughts and the realization of complete collapse overwhelmed her. Isolation, depression, and grief slowly but surely filled her soul. She saw no real way out or source of hope that could salvage the situation. All her final attempts to maintain control over Egypt, to negotiate with Octavian, seemed increasingly futile and meaningless. Faith in the dream of a glorious future for Egypt and the Ptolemaic dynasty succumbed to the crushing blows of fate, and she found herself on the very edge of the abyss, seeing no way back. Unwilling to become a Roman captive, to be paraded in Octavian's triumphal procession, the ultimate humiliation for a queen, Cleopatra understood that the only way to avoid utter disgrace and preserve at least a remnant of royal dignity was to accept her fate, the fate of the great Queen of Egypt. She answered time's challenge with a final act of will, demonstrating not only her defiance against the Roman conqueror, but also the determination and pride that had been her hallmark throughout her life. Vainly making last efforts to secure some acceptable alliance or gain mercy from Octavian, she found herself feeling a complete loss of control over her own life. Although she still hoped for the best for her children, vague images of a future shrouded in uncertainty and threat from the Romans increasingly filled her mind. The destruction of her legacy and the potential use of her children by Octavian to legitimize his power became the grim motto of her final days. She perhaps dreamed of returning to moments when her people lived in peace and prosperity under her rule. But Rome, now represented by Octavian, became for her a symbol of hatred and threat, consuming everything around it. In this ruthless world of political games, where there was no longer a place for her as an independent ruler, only one path remained, one way to preserve her dignity, to abandon her struggle and leave this abhorrent existence on her own terms. In the desperate hour, when her entire life and truth were vanishing before her eyes, she resolved upon the tragic step whispered about for centuries. As a wise ruler and woman, recognizing the final images of greatness, she chose the path, suicide presumably by the bite of an asp, that would prevent her from being led captive to Rome. And at that moment, her name shone forever in history as a bright, albeit tragic star, representing the endless struggle for freedom, dignity, and independence in the face of omnipotent power. The death of Cleopatra XIII, Cleopatra in 30 BC, was, without exaggeration, one of the most dramatic and symbolic events in the history of the ancient world. At the height of her personal power and influence as Queen of Egypt, an ally of the most powerful Roman general, she was forced to confront the inevitability of Roman expansion and absorption. Her tragic fate was quickly perceived as a reflection of broader social and political changes, the end of the Hellenistic kingdoms and the rise of the Roman Empire. Following her death, the Roman army under Octavian decisively completed the conquest and annexation of Egypt, transforming it into the wealthiest province under the emperor's direct control. This event not only strengthened Rome's economic and political influence on the international stage, it symbolized the conclusion of the struggle for Alexander the Great's legacy. Soon, Cleopatra's image began to be used not only as a symbol of the fall of an ancient and majestic civilization, but also as a powerful tool of political propaganda directed against her late ally Antony and everything he represented. Octavian, who became the first Roman emperor under the name Augustus, carefully cultivated his idealized image as a defender of traditional Roman values and principles. In this context, he actively contrasted himself with the Eastern threat, personified in his version precisely by Cleopatra. Her death was presented as the triumph of Roman ideals, discipline, and morality over the immoral and decadent Eastern world. Roman propaganda depicted her as a treacherous and cunning Eastern queen whose personal relationships with Caesar and Antony were merely means to achieve power. Cleopatra was often presented as a woman using solely her beauty and sexuality to manipulate great Romans, which, according to Octavian's version, led Antony to his downfall. This image aligned with common stereotypes in Roman culture about Eastern women and the dangers they posed to strict Roman morals. Chronicles of the time, largely written under the influence of Roman propaganda, began portraying her in this light, as a woman using her beauty and cunning only to achieve her selfish goals, ignoring the interests of her people and Rome. However, despite these negative and biased interpretations, Cleopatra also left a profound mark on world culture and art. Her figure, shrouded in an aura of mystery, power, and tragedy, became a symbol of might, passion, and fateful destiny. Her amazing story of love, political intrigue, and inevitable fall continued and continues to inspire artists, writers, playwrights, and composers throughout the centuries. Stories related to her life and relationships with Caesar and Antony quickly became embellished with myths and legends that reflected the spirit of the times in which they were created and the author's perceptions of the East, power, and femininity. Cleopatra's image evolved over time, from the negative portrayal in Roman propaganda as a cunning manipulator to a symbol of female strength, independence, and even a tragic heroine. This demonstrates how complex and multifaceted female roles in history can be, and how the perception of these roles changes depending on the cultural and historical context. Over the centuries, Cleopatra has appeared as the heroine of numerous plays, the most famous being William Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, paintings, operas, and literary works. Prominent artists like Edward Poynter and Lawrence Alma Tadema captured her image in their monumental works, contributing to a strong visual narrative where she appeared simultaneously as a regal lady and a powerful political leader. These interpretations created and continue to create space for reflecting on her life in the context of current issues about power, gender identity, and the struggle for one's place in the world. The costumes and portrayals used to represent Cleopatra in theater and film, from silent movies to the epic 1963 production with Elizabeth Taylor, have inspired designers for many years, offering them opportunities to explore themes of beauty, luxury, and power embodied in her persona. She became a symbol of female strength, autonomy, and the right to self-determination, qualities that made her a significant figure for movements striving for equality and justice. Reinterpreting Cleopatra's image, from the stereotype of a manipulator to a more complex understanding of her political struggle, has highlighted the active role of women in history, allowing contemporary researchers and thinkers to reconsider established biases. Thus, Cleopatra's death became not only a moment of decline for a majestic Hellenistic state, but also the foundation for constructing cultural myths that solidified her image as an eternal symbol of female strength, resilience, and inextricably linked her fate with the might and fall of Rome. Simultaneously, the resurrection of her image in story and culture has allowed for an open re-evaluation of gender roles and social expectations, which remains relevant today. Cleopatra's legacy continues to evoke genuine interest and sincere admiration worldwide. She transforms into a symbol of awakening femininity in the fight for one's rights, despite the complex and contradictory perception of her personality in historical tradition. Cleopatra is not just the ruler of a vanished Egyptian kingdom, but a figure whose actions, decisions, and life itself extend far beyond her time, offering valuable lessons for modernity. Her story is not merely a captivating tale of love, political maneuvers, and tragedy. It represents a universal struggle for autonomy, for the right to have one's own voice in a society that tries to diminish or silence it. Modern feminist movements actively use her image as a symbol of a strong woman, fighting for her ideals, her country, and her place under the sun in a world ruled by men. Over time, Cleopatra has come to embody strength, intellect, and independence. And her legacy is increasingly analyzed today through the lens of gender issues. In this context, her brilliant political maneuvers, diplomatic artistry, and tactical skill are recalled, which allowed her not only to hold power under extremely difficult conditions, but also to successfully contend with powerful adversaries like Roman generals and politicians. Cleopatra was no mere puppet in the hands of men, even great ones like Caesar and Antony. She used her connections, her sharp intellect, her charisma, and her will to survive and succeed in a world initially created and governed by men. Her story in art and culture confirms her significance. Cleopatra became a central figure in many works of art and literature, where her story of passion, power, and tragedy intertwines with eternal themes of love, ambition, and fate. Great playwrights and writers, including Shakespeare, turned to her image to explore the very nature of human passions, conflicts, and moral choices. These works continue to hook audiences and readers, making them ponder what lies behind the external displays of strength and power, how personal feelings influence politics, and how women fight for their place. Cleopatra in these narratives is often presented as a powerful, intelligent, and passionate woman whose personal aspirations and involvement in political dramas literally push her to the brink of catastrophe. It should also be noted that public perception of Cleopatra has significantly moved away from the simplistic stereotypes formed in ancient and later history, becoming far more diverse and multi-layered. She ceased to be just the cunning Eastern ruler seducing Romans. Instead, her life is increasingly viewed in the context of her real political struggle for power, independence, and the survival of her country amidst Roman domination. This shift in perception allows modern readers and viewers to find a deeper connection with Cleopatra's image, perceiving her as a complex personality with her own voice, will, and sometimes tragic motives. Art and culture become arenas where her story is not only retold, but her aspirations, ambitions, and challenges to her era are celebrated. Contemporary artists, musicians, and writers draw inspiration from her life, creating new interpretations that reflect current social currents and issues of feminism, power, and gender identity. Recognizing the complexity of her character and the extraordinariness of her aspirations, our society seeks ways to restore her reputation as a symbol not only of beauty, but also of outstanding political power and resilience. This rebirth of Cleopatra's image sparks a new wave of interest that continues to generate important discussions about female identity, power, and influence in society. Thus, Cleopatra, with her outstanding personality and complex relationship with history and culture, becomes a symbol of a new wave of the women's movement and a reevaluation of women's roles. She serves as a source of inspiration not only for those who want to study her story as a historical figure, but also for everyone striving for expanded rights and equality. Cleopatra and Antony, whose names are forever linked, continue to fascinate people, and researchers and artists find numerous themes for deep analysis in their lives and fate. The number of adaptations of their story, whether epic films, theatrical productions, operas, or fiction, only increases over the years. This reflects not only their personal dramas and passions, but also the broader social and cultural contexts that make their story relevant for each new generation. For understanding contemporary social processes, their story serves as a basis for deep analysis of gender relations, power dynamics, and the influence of personal feelings on political decisions. In turn, this allows audiences to glimpse the complex dynamics of power and relationships embodied in their fates. Theater, being one of the first forms to transmit their story to the public, has always used their lives for staging performances, presenting both the sweet moments of their love and power and the bitter scenes of their fall and tragedy. Classic works like Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra are increasingly reinterpreted by directors aiming not just to show historical drama, but also to pay tribute to Cleopatra's complex nature as a woman capable of being simultaneously in love and calculating, passionate, and extremely intelligent. Cinematic adaptations, from early films to the iconic 1963 production starring Elizabeth Taylor, show much more than just the aesthetic beauty of historical figures. Adaptations in subsequent years, including some documentaries and modern feature films, emphasize not only their personal connections and romantic relationships, but also the large-scale political games they played on the Mediterranean stage. These films explore how their relationship became an arena for the clash between the Eastern exoticism of Egypt and Roman traditions and ambitions, creating an interesting contrast that retains its relevance today. Literature also continues to find inspiration in their dramatic fate, creating ever-new interpretations that skillfully blend historical accuracy as much as possible and fictional character depth. Novels and other works dedicated to Cleopatra take on the important task of rethinking her image. She is increasingly presented not just as a stereotypical manipulator, but as a realistic, pragmatic, and exceptionally intelligent ruler, doing everything possible to preserve her people, her influence, and her country in the face of insurmountable force. This transformation of Cleopatra's image shows how important it is to consider the cultural historical context in which she lived and ruled, and how easily stereotypes can distort reality. As a result, her life and actions move to the center of attention, forcing modern society to reflect on fundamental questions about the role of women in history and the biases that still exist. Numerous exhibitions dedicated to the culture and art of ancient Egypt and Rome actively include motifs and characters associated with Cleopatra and Antony. Artists, through their works, try to illuminate themes of power, love, culture, and their influence on women's lives and roles in society. They also strive to take Cleopatra beyond traditional stereotypes, highlighting her as a true strategic master, an outstanding politician, and a strong personality sometimes mistakenly perceived only through the prism of her personal relationships and romantic liaisons. Thus, their story continues to provoke discussions and reflections on power, status, influence, and gender issues, creating a fertile ground for further analysis of the complex interactions between gender and politics throughout the centuries. The narratives of Cleopatra and Antony serve not only as examples of rich cultural heritage, but also as living proof of how ancient canons and plots continue to influence modern narratives, social structures, and politics, compelling us to contemplate their lessons more deeply. Their story is not just a romantic saga of passionate love ending in tragedy. It is also a mirror reflecting the complex and timeless processes of power, betrayal, ambition, and personal choice that operate in our own time. Every step, every decision made by these outstanding historical figures became an important milestone in shaping the political landscape of their era and left an indelible mark. Their story is, in essence, a warning about how private intrigues, personal feelings, and mistakes can affect the fates of entire peoples and states. Cleopatra's struggle against mighty Rome demonstrates how even one woman, possessing exceptional intellect, charisma, and will, can challenge even such powerful empires as the Roman one. Her connections with Caesar and Antony were not only deeply personal and loving relationships, but also carefully calculated strategic alliances aimed at preserving Egypt's independence amidst growing external pressure. An important lesson from this story is that in the world of high power, personal connections can play a decisive and sometimes fatal role. However, they also create enormous vulnerability when interests and emotions intertwine in complex, dangerous webs. The relationship between Cleopatra and Antony is a classic example of how ambition, passion, and personal feelings can intersect with political duties, creating situations where one mistake, one wrong step, can lead to complete downfall. Antony, torn between his love for Cleopatra and his duty to Rome, or at least his ambitions in Rome, ultimately brought about the destruction of their union and his own demise. This eternal conflict between individual desires and political or social obligations remains relevant today, as many people face choices between personal aspirations, career ambitions, and relationships. Cleopatra, despite her status as a ruler and her outward splendor, showed that even the strongest and most influential individuals can become hostages of their own decisions, circumstances, and emotions. She became a symbol not only of love and devotion, though these aspects are often debated, but also of calculation, strategic thinking, and unyielding will, making her a multifaceted and complex figure. The lesson we can draw from her life is the importance of maintaining rational thinking and cool calculation, even amidst strong emotions and personal attachments, and strategically planning one's steps, aware of their potential consequences. Furthermore, their story shows how historical figures can become hostages of their own myth created by others. Cleopatra is most often viewed in popular culture as a manipulator using her beauty for political ends. However, it's important to note that such simplistic stereotypes often silence or underestimate her outstanding political talent, brilliant education, and real ability to conduct complex diplomatic games between different cultures and powers. Therefore, the modern perception of Cleopatra serves as an important reminder of how easily bias and simplification can distort historical reality and undervalue women's achievements. The complex interactions between gifts of fate, betrayal, love, and the drive for power in their relationship point to fundamental aspects of leadership, power, and human nature. Like Cleopatra, we must consider the consequences of our decisions, strive for fairness, and find balance in personal and social relationships. This deep connection between their ancient history and modernity not only enriches our understanding of the past, but also encourages us to reflect on how we can avoid the same mistakes in our own lives and society. Thus, the stratagems, strategies, and fatal decisions of Cleopatra and Antony become a handbook for everyone, referencing important lessons about human nature, loyalty, power, and the inevitability of fate.